Channel 12.
Channel 12.
All righty, I call to order the Budget, Finance and Growth Committee meeting for May 17th. We're starting a little early than we normally do, but it all is good because I think everybody's happy to get it over with early and be done with the rest of their board day, at least for the folks who don't have to do any more board business for the day. As we do, it's like only me, right? As we do at every board Budget, Finance, Growth Committee meeting. We're just gonna go around the room and introduce ourselves. So we will start in the corner with Ms. Davis.
Good morning, Michael Gustin, Assistant Treasurer.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Wagner, Chief Financial Officer. I was the CIO 10 years ago.
Kevin Ashley, Director.
Good morning, Dr. Moffitt, board member.
Brandon Craig, board member.
Ben Lindy, board member.
Emily Bell asked me, Local 232.
Good morning, Lauren Roberts, Chief Audit Executive.
Isaac Karn, Internal Audit Supervisor.
All righty. So we will kind of get ourselves started here. I don't know that there's any budget updates since we haven't really done anything on the budget since our last committee meeting. So if there's anything else that we want to update outside of what we discussed at Wednesday's special meeting, Treasurer Wagner.
Good morning. So Mike, Derek and I met yesterday and went through the document that came from the board and finished out costing out all the items so that at least there's dollar values with everything we could figure out. Some of the things we just needed clarity on, didn't really understand what was being asked for. So we'll review that on Monday night. And we talked about creating a small budget task force to kind of regroup, review while we're verifying that all the budgets have been submitted and all the approved reductions are in fact reflected in the budget, so that things don't accidentally get included. So we're just very busy right now. And we'll give another update on Monday to the board.
Perfect. As always, we keep this on the agenda until we have a budget. So when that fateful day comes, we'll probably take it off the agenda and then start with budget for next year. Throw it on the agenda. So well, then we'll go right on back to the treasurer for our monthly financials.
All right, thank you. So Kevin's going to actually do the presentation, but just to start us off, that for the public and a reminder to the board that every school district in the state of Ohio is required to file 5-year forecasts twice a year, and it's just on the general fund. And then so I'll just hand it over to Kevin Ashley.
You want to do the forecast first?
Yes, forecast first, yes.
Okay, cool. So these should be on board docs, I believe. See copies of them. So really, Monday night is when we'll do the formal presentation for the board. As you know, Ohio Department of Education, of course, requires the district to submit a 5-year forecast twice a year by the end of November and by the end of May. So the main purpose of this is to fulfill that requirement. Yeah. Thank you. Sure. So we'll go through the slides. Obviously, the forecast is a lot of numbers, a lot of layers to it, but we'll kind of hit some of the key points in the forecast through the slides. And then if you have any questions and if there are any suggestions, we can make changes between now and the board meeting if there are things that you would like to be included or otherwise. So the first slide talks a little bit about some of the considerations for the forecast. These are really things that are kind of unknown at this time, but could impact where the numbers end up at the end of the day. Some factors is potential legislative action that's either been discussed or expressed. One of the things we heard a lot recently was the, possible elimination of the 20 mil floor for schools. That only affects school districts and it only affects certain levies, current expense levies and inside millage. But if that were to change, that would have a negative impact on our revenues. Some other changes that were talked about recently was with county reappraisals of property taxes. Currently, the county auditor is directed to use the most recent year of sales to drive that reappraisal. One of the legislative considerations would be to make it a 3-year average. And even when they talked about that, it was just a temporary fix. So, we'll just have to see what they decide going forward. Always hear different things, but we just wanted to highlight those two in particular.
Both of those things, both of those items, will impact our property tax collections.
Yes. Another thing that makes forecasting somewhat difficult, in my opinion, is it touches 3 state biennial budgets. So the current year, we're in the 24-25, those 2 fiscal years, and then there'll be 26-27 and 28-29. So as you know, the state biennial budget is approved every 2 years. And we historically see a lot of changes come at that time. So we can't really, we can project and we can estimate and approximate, but we don't know where that will end up. The other thing, we talked about the fair school funding plan. We're going into year 4 of that. And then there'll be the year 5 and year 6 will be in the next biennial budget, but we anticipate they'll still include the phase-ins as anticipated, but again, an uncertainty at this point. We do include some inflationary rates, obviously. We anticipate some of that. Another key thing, and we talked to, one thing I did want to point out in November, we presented to finance 2 scenarios. One of holding expenditures down to what our anticipated revenues were. And the other one was more of a traditional, what you would expect the growth to be. So one of the key things that happened at the subsequent to that is that the board at that time committed to hold future budget expenditures within those revenue lines. So this time we're coming to you with a forecast that looks like that, and will be contingent upon holding those expenditures down. Obviously, we've talked about the cliff expenditures related to the return of ESSER to the general fund. So you'll see some of that in the current year in current year expenses, but really next year's budget that's on the forecast. Student enrollment projections versus actual. Again, those are projected. We don't know exactly what those will be, but we have some history to base that on, and so those are included. And then collective bargaining agreement terms obviously will impact any changes going forward. Okay, that was a lot for one slide, but the next slide, just wanted to talk a little bit about property tax revenue and changes to state funding. As you know, there was some discussion earlier about with the reappraisal, the district is receiving about $7 million more in property taxes for this half for this year. So, and that's in addition to, we had already built in, the forecast already built in some increase. As you know, this was a really historical increase in reappraisal and with the 20 mil floor effect. So we were able to build in an additional amount this year and going into next year. The flip side of that, just to be a consideration, going forward with the state funding, that will increase what's viewed as our local capacity, or it will result in a larger burden for our local taxpayers. So on the one hand, we will see increased property tax revenue, but incrementally as the values are, because it looks at a 3-year average. And so as that higher value, like within 3 years, it'll have a full effect, it will reduce our state funding somewhat. That is going to be a little bit offset by the increase in the phase-ins. So just to kind of give you the components that go into that. So you can't just take everything in isolation. You look at property taxes, but then it does have an effect on our state revenue as well.
And Kevin, I think that's a really good point to emphasize here, because while we think about funding in the sense of we get a set of amounts for this year, the funding formula is built off of this belief that you become a wealthy district by the property values, not by the actual wealth index of your community. And so yes, we get more money this year because our property's worth more. The state in turn says, then you're a wealthier district.
Yeah, so we're putting together a slide deck to kind of walk through the state funding formula so people understand, because the wealth index calculation is very convoluted, I would say, but so maybe we'll do that at the next finance committee meeting as well. But you're right. So when our local income goes up, our state share goes down.
Another component is this, the disadvantaged people impact aid, formerly referred to as economically disadvantaged. Basically that one, we do get indexed against all other districts. And there's been some changes, and that is actually resulting even in this year in a little bit of a reduction in that funding.
It was about $2 million, right?
I think so, yeah. Next slide, is again, just a summary. This is kind of the format we did when we were giving you two different scenarios. So I went ahead and left it, but the key point I'll show here is the yellow. That is the point at which ODEW looks at to see if the district is projecting fiscal distress. If those were to be negative, any of those in the current year or the next 2 years, that would result in they would come asking for additional explanation of what our plan would be to rectify that. Next slide just shows what the base cost per pupil calculation is for CPS. 42.8%. So they calculate everything of what it would, what it would take to educate students in the district. And at the end of the day, so the per pupil cost is $8,097. And then for that, we get 42 cents on the dollar from the state, and the rest is burden on local taxpayers. Next slide is district educated enrollment. This does not include preschool. So just wanted to make sure that, so we see a lot of different enrollment numbers sometimes, but this is particularly the prior years, that is ties exactly to what the Ohio Department of Education accepted as our final enrollment figures. Again, it excludes preschool because we only get funded for special education preschool students. Next slide. This is when we do the software, it gives you just kind of a visual of what the local tax share is, the state funding share, and then all other revenue. The thing that just want to point out, if you compare this to what we did in November, in the meantime, we've talked a lot about the tax anticipation notes that were issued. That skews some of these percentages. So the more realistic percentages, if we had not had to do that short-term borrowing, would be that local taxes represent 57%, and state funding represents 31%. So just kind of want to make a point of that. Next slide is total revenues. And I like this slide just because it kind of shows the trajectory. We're always going to have peaks and valleys, and then we'll have explanations for that. But you can kind of see where the trend is going to be. I did point out the anomalies there, the $75 million tax anticipation note this year, and the dash line would be without that. The lighter blue at the end represents the renewal levy. And it's basically the 48. So the last year it says 46.5 million. The levy typically generates 48 million, or it's built to generate 48. But for projection purposes, it's usually more at the historical collection rate, which is about 97%.
And the year before that, it's a half of a year because of the property taxes roll on a calendar year basis. We're on a June 30 fiscal year basis.
And the thing one reason we report it that way is ODEW requires us to anticipate what our situation would be without the renewal and with the renewal. Next slide breaks down a little bit of the taxes and property tax rollbacks. Again, it has 3 years of actuals and 5 years of projection, including this year. There is a category on there for new levies, but if we were to model that, it would show up here. At this point, we are not modeling that. We're only modeling the renewals. Next slide is state aid and state foundation. The one that kind of jumps out there is 2021, which was when we were getting the pass-through funding. So next year that will drop off. I mean, we won't have to refer to that anymore, but for now it is an anomaly. So I want to point that out. And then we also noted the restricted section, the yellow section, some of the components that go in there. The student wellness comes in as restricted to general fund. DPIA, English language learners, gifted education, career tech education are all included in that bucket.
So what that means is like the gifted money in the formula, that money has to be spent on gifted education and not on other things. And so they go and check to make sure that our spending codes are properly allocated out.
Most of our grants are required to go in a separate fund altogether. In this instance, they just are identified as restricted, and there's reporting requirements for some of those. Next slide is showing all other revenue, which is a lot of different things. The gray one is a big piece of that, is advances in as we get near the end of the year. Some of our grant funds are waiting on reimbursement, and so we will advance funds at that time. It was a little higher at the end of 23 because we were waiting on ESSER reimbursements from the state. Next slide, switching gears to expenditures. Again, the $75 million repayment of the tax anticipation notes, again, skews the percentages. So if you look in the note, personnel costs traditionally represent about 73% of our total expenditures, and purchase services would be about 19%. Next slide gives an overview of expenditures. Again, that same representation, excluding then the 75 million for tax anticipations.
And this assumes we hold true to our expenditures don't go greater than our revenues. So we force the expenditures to meet the forecasted revenues.
And again, that, we made that dedication because we want to maintain a certain level of cash on hand as well. But also because truly that's what we're supposed to be doing, is budgeting, is maintaining a budget that is balanced. I think that is also something for us, again, why we need to start the process early next year, or this year, next year's budget, is because there are going to be cuts again, because things don't get cheaper each year. They just get more expensive.
Exactly.
And so there are things that we are still currently doing that we will currently budget for, that next year we're going to have to look at how do we pay for these things when the prices go up, right? So when you're buying, I think about this today, where you're buying a piece of lumber today costs more than it did 10 years ago. You still got to buy it, right? You still got to do these things. And so the reality is that we're going to have to figure some of those things out as we go along. It's better to do it earlier, build a better process to do it so that we get it done on time.
Well, and the growth in having to meet the needs of our students increases the school budgets. For example, in next year's budget, we're adding 11 autism classes. So that's a teacher and a para that hits the paraprofessional. That increases the school budgets. And then we added 8 English as a second language teachers because of our second language students population is growing. But when you keep your revenues flat, that just means more cuts to the central office, right? Because the pie doesn't get bigger. It just changes I'm trying to figure out how to do that in a graphic, but so yeah, so that the needs of our students puts challenges on maintaining a balanced budget.
All right, and then the next slide is our forecast summary. Again, you'll see the last 4 columns to the right. We have revenues equaling expenditures, which would maintain a cash balance of about $55 million in the general fund. which given that our budget is in the $600 million plus range, I think Jen's going to talk a little bit about cash balances going forward, but just highlighting that here. Timing wise, with encumbrances, we're usually looking at about $10 million less at the end of each year. But in terms of cash balance, this is what we would project based on the current forecast.
So, yeah, the next slide shows the cash balances history and going forward. Thank you. And then this software that we use to do the forecasting actually calculates it on a 365-day basis. I don't know why they actually include weekends, but what it's telling us is that at the end of fiscal year 24, we'll have 29 days of cash on hand. Typically, don't suggest 60 days at least. So that would put us up at about 140 million on cash. And the reason why that's important is because our state revenues come in equally twice a month, but our property taxes only come in twice a year. And so you have these peaks and then you have these valleys when in December, so it's property taxes come in August, and by December, you've been spending down that cash, and then our debt payments hit. And so that's probably our lowest point in cash. And you need to make sure that you have enough cash on hand, not tied up in investments or anything, but so that you can meet your obligations. And so I'm going to next month be proposing a new policy that will require a cash reserve of a minimum. We're still trying to work out what that right value is, so that we can start building back our reserves again.
And we talked about this at the end of last year as well, because the concerns around, again, things that came in later, the things that have come in, again, this is part of the practice of getting people to put expenses in or to use the resources that they have quicker.
Right.
So that we can actually pay for these things along the way, as opposed to having everything come in at a set time, which then puts us really cash strapped to pay for things or to be able to fully pay for things and be able to maintain the rest of what we need to pay for on a regular basis.
Right. And then, the ESSER funds were a blessing to the district, of course, but the rule is you spend the money and then they reimburse you. So in December, we were waiting on $40 million of reimbursement. And so that also adds a challenge. Now, of course, ESSER's going away at the end of this year. So that cash challenge and the smaller districts had a really hard time dealing with that cash flow issue. So that challenge will kind of go away, but it's still all of our other state and federal grants require us to pay the money out first and then they reimburse us in the following month.
So that's my last slide. The only thing I may not have mentioned was it only covers the general fund, the forecast. But that's the requirement that we present.
Any questions, Dr. Ma?
So I do have a couple of questions, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm not exactly sure. So Rob, if you could go to slide 10. When we talk about the grants and the aid, Jen, I think one of you two mentioned, either Jen or Tevin, about how when the needs of our students change and we have more students that are English learners and students that have disabilities, do we get more money from the state for them? So we would be required to just pay the staffing. I mean, like out of the general fund, would it be, and the district has to have an increase?
So the base cost is calculated on a 3-year average of your enrollment or the last year, whichever is higher. But the categorical spending is applied to your current enrollment. So if your current enrollment's going up for gifted or ESL or students with disabilities, you do get more weighted funding, but remember, we only get 42 cents on the dollar. So
So it's not nearly enough. I get
Correct.
that, but I mean, but just from a layperson's term, it's going up. We're getting more, but it's still not enough to completely cover the expenses of our students, even in the grant.
Right.
phase. That's really what I'm.
So if you remember a couple months ago, I shared in public the historical budgets, I think pre-COVID through now. And you could see the budget for the students with disabilities or Department of Student Services has grown dramatically because of that. So yes.
And then my other question, we had the lunch with legislators or the breakfast with legislators, and this came up, and I kind of want to put this here for my colleagues. You talked about our enrollment is based K through 12, but we are not including preschoolers. What's the number of preschoolers that are missing? and that we are potentially missing funding for?
So we have about 2,000 preschool students that we educate in Cincinnati Public Schools. We do get funding for, I think we saw 329. We were talking about this yesterday. So preschool students with disabilities are funded in the state funding formula, 42 cents on the dollar. But our regular ed preschool students are funded through other sources. So we have state and federal grants that help. We have the levy that's coming up, the $48 million renewal levy coming up, not this November, the following November. We have a $15 million set aside to help expand preschool. And we've both Cincinnati Public Schools and the Cincinnati Preschool Promise have outgrown that budget. And so we have to make some decisions, either increase the value of the levy or find alternate funding sources or scale back.
Okay, I guess those are good problems to have for most people, but for us from a financial standpoint, it's not so good. So we talked about proposing to the legislators, because this is a state issue, really, a funding
Right.
issue, that we talked about the school funding formula, which is why I brought that up. Because really, this is about getting funding for preschoolers would help us. Is that
Right.
the only thing that we could do to really lobby to get some additional assistance for us?
Right, so the state, you're only required for, what's it called, mandatory education is fifth grade, 5-year-olds kindergarten, what did you say? Compulsory, thank you, I couldn't think of that word. Compliance was stuck in my head and I knew that wasn't right. So what we would like but the data shows that when you have high quality preschool, their students are better prepared for kindergarten and they're more successful and the dropout rates are reduced further on down the line. So we would like the state to help fund that so that our students are more successful.
Okay, those are my questions. Oh, one more question, I'm sorry. The 20 mil floor, can you talk about that? We talk about that very loosely, but I don't know if the public really understands what that is. And we did bring that up with the legislators as well, just
So-
briefly.
So it's a kind of I don't even know, do you know when it started? Was it back in the 80s?
I was thinking the 70s, or yeah, it might have been the 80s as a result of, well, no, I'm thinking of the House Bill 960.
Decades ago,
reduction
right?
factor, but yeah.
So it's an
Yes.
arbitrary number that says that districts must have at least 20 mils of value of valuation income in order to operate as a district, right? So, but it only applies to fixed rate levies, we have 3 fixed sum levies. So our property tax is divided into 2. We have 3 fixed sum levies that represent about half of our property taxes, and then the rest are fixed rate levies. So the 20 mil floor only applies to your fixed rate levies and your inside millage, right?
Yes.
So House Bill 920, whenever that was enacted back in the late 70s, it says that property taxes can't grow with inflation. So they reduce the millage rate, and the values go up, they reduce the millage rate, so you're collecting about the same amount that the voters approved at that election. And so as your millage rate continues to go down because property values are going up, once you hit that 20 mil, if you go below the 20 mil, they automatically increase the rates to get you back up to the 20 mils. And we hit that last year. We started, I think our fixed rate millage as originally enacted was up in the 60 millage rate, and we're now below the 20 mil floor.
That
But
might
don't quote me on those numbers because
Yeah.
I'm going off my head.
No, that's
top of my
okay.
head.
I think this sounds like a Just Ask Jen topic for sure, but
Yeah.
but I just wanted people to know that we are limited on things that we can ask for with regard to our levies as far as the amount, right? For now.
No, you
Because
can
the
put on the
20 mil
ballot whatever levy, whatever millage you think, basically it's what you think you can pass,
Okay.
right? So if you needed 100 mil levy, you can put it on the ballot, but it probably won't pass, right? So you're limited once you do a levy, you're limited on what your options are to renew it or change it. And then some levies have the rollback credit, and anything that's enacted after 2013, when that law changed, doesn't have the rollback credit. So it's a 1 mil of tax is more costly to the homeowner because they're not getting the credit on their tax bill. That makes sense.
It does to me, but I think we should have a just ask Jen topic.
Oh, thanks, sorry.
Good morning, everyone. And Treasurer, thank you for the presentation. I had just a couple questions on the, I'm sure I should remember why this is the case, but I'm looking at row 4.5 on the 5-year forecast where it has total expenditures. And I'm just looking historically at 21 and 22, and it's about $300 million less than the other years. I
Yes.
cannot remember why. That's a big number.
That was the time when we were in the school-wide pool. So back on No Child Left Behind, they allow us to commingle our state and federal grants with the general fund. So they created a whole different fund number.
Yeah.
And so you put money into that fund called the school-wide pool. So that schools only have to deal with one budget instead of three.
I got it. So like if this were reflecting all the title funds and had like a total expenditures across all of those funds, it would look more similar.
So
over
you'll
the
see it
different
in the section where there's in the transfers out. You'll see that opposite change there.
Line 5010.
So we were
Yep.
transferring 200 million out and now we're only transferring 17 million out.
Yep.
Because that's, the 17 million is to help, to make our debt payment. So we had transfer
Yep.
money into the debt fund and pay money out of the debt fund.
So if you follow 5.05, then the total spend stays closer to the same figure.
Exactly.
Yeah, I got you.
So instead of being reflected in salaries and other things, we made a transfer to the school-wide pool and the payments were made out of that fund
Yep.
instead of here.
That makes sense. And thank you for the reminder. I think the other question I had was, I'm looking at fiscal year 25, line 4.5. That's the 592.
4.5,
But the
592, yes.
yeah, and Jen, I may be looking at the wrong. It may make more sense actually, given what you just said, to look at 5.05. But
Right.
what I'm trying to figure out is, this forecast assumes that we're able to get to a spending target.
Right,
Right.
so if you recall, the 623 million is our budget target.
So then, right. So then so the 623. So well, I think can you just remind me how close or far away are we from 623 as of today?
I can't answer that because it's not everybody has finished submitting their budgets and I don't want to mislead anybody with a value.
But could we just rewind then with the last time we had a number that we felt reasonably confident in, how close or far away were we?
So at the last board meeting, not Wednesday, but the Monday before that, the superintendent communicated a $13 million gap still.
13 million?
Mhm.
Okay. I appreciate and agree with everything you said about needing to scrub all of this and check things so numbers don't move around. So I will hold you to none of this. Once that scrubbing is done, do you expect that 13 number to stay about the same, to go up or go down?
I can't answer.
Unsure. And I
can't
think it's
answer
an
that right
honest
now.
answer is fine. Like if we're not sure, we're just not sure.
I think before we do make any other changes and decisions, it's gonna go up.
Yeah.
Simply because we started this process with working with the current budget and adding step increases because we're already in the collective bargaining agreements and the ASME agreement. And then we added what we thought were gonna be the recurring costs out of ESSER. And then we started comparing that to the budget target and started just making decisions about what are we not gonna fund this year. So working backwards, but that assumes nothing changes in the current budget. Well, we know that the school budgets went up. Like I explained, we just added autism classes and ESL teachers. So the school budgets went up by about $8.5 million. So that adds to that gap challenge too. So instead of continuing to reduce, we just needed to build the budget and start figuring out what the real gap is. But I can, at last look, there were still things missing for a variety of reasons. Like one person was out on paternity leave, so they didn't get their budget submitted on time, but so we're working through that and I'll have a better number on Monday.
Got it. So, and all that I think makes sense. So somewhere in the neighborhood of could be, we don't know, but it could be higher than 13. And so the charge that we're now facing as a board is we've got to get that 13 million-ish higher, lower to zero. We have until June 30.
Yes, so we're required to have an appropriations resolution adopted by June 30.
Yeah.
Or on July 1, I can't issue any checks, including payroll. So, but you can do a temporary, we've done these before, a temporary appropriation that gives you 90 days to finish the work.
It's like asking your teacher for an extension on the homework.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes,
Yeah, got it. Got it. Yeah, I may have some more questions, but the 13 is helpful. And I appreciate what you said about needing to scrub the number, and we'll hold you and everybody to none of that. But I just, from my perspective, it's a lot of work to figure out in a month and a half.
yes, I agree.
Thank you.
All right. And again, the 90 days, what we did last year, because we couldn't, as a board, balance our budget on time. It's a thing that we should be better at, and it's why we should start the process sooner this year, which is what we will strive to do out of this committee. Anything else on
So,
the,
This will be presented again Monday night for the full board in
Yes.
public and asking for adoptions. We have until the end of the month to file it with the state.
and then again, there's for folks who can view on board docs, is a more written out prose version of some information as well, that will, it's there to support.
Yeah, so included is there a document that has all the notes that goes with and explanations and footnotes. So I highly recommend reading that. It explains the numbers.
Some great authors to that document. I hear they're fantastic employees.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Alrighty, so then we want to tackle the monthly financials next.
You gonna kick us off, Mike? Or Kevin? Who started? Kevin.
Now you get 2 doses. I mean, that's not good. But I'll kind of make it brief since I already covered the other stuff, but these are just our monthly financials for April. I'll start on slide 4. That first overview slide is gonna hit some of the highlights I'm gonna talk about. As we talked about before, you know, we added some graphs in the last few months, just to kind of give a little bit more perspective. So this first one is our cash and investment balances in $1 million for all of the funds. So not just general fund. We'll cover those a little bit later, but the blue is our operating cash. That's basically in our US Bank general accounts. Star Ohio investments, as you know, are pretty liquid investments. We can call that money pretty much at any time if we need to. The gray category is long-term investments. Those are in obviously longer term items that we don't have as readily available. The debt related is the yellow, and most of that is in sinking funds that will make what we would refer to as like balloon payments as those issues mature. So that's what that represents. The grand total is 250 million total. And you'll see that on another slide. The next slide is, again, just perspective, looking at our general banking account, the 3-year history, as Jen mentioned earlier, about those peaks and valleys of where our cash, you know, our readily available cash sits. The green is the current year, the bold green is the current year. And at the end of April, we were looking at $48 million in that account.
So that those valleys, you can see they can sometimes change from one month or another. And it's usually because there's a 3 pay period month. And it changes every year. So
Okay, the next slide breaks it down by fund type. So our cash balance for the general fund at the end of April was 101 million, 1.7 million. One reason it's, you know, on the higher side is because we have just got our first half tax settlement. So from here to July, when we start getting property tax advances again, that number is going to continue to go down. Debt service fund. So what we have on our ledgers is 89.6 million. Internal service funds are things such as payroll remittances and those types of things that go through a clearing account, basically. State and federal grants, obviously we're showing as red there, and that's because we make those expenditures ahead of time, and then we get reimbursement from the Department of Education and Workforce. So it actually is lower this month, I think, than it has been over the last few months. Again, there's the 250.9 million total by type. A couple slides, we'll do general fund. So just in terms of cash balance and encumbrance, as we've talked about before, you know, so the tax anticipation note effect is not here because we received the money and we paid it out. But basically coming into the year with a lower cash balance is what has resulted in us being lower compared to the prior years. Encumbrances are trending down, which is a good thing. Next slide is the 3-year history of general fund cash balance. Again, you see the green is the current year and how that relates to the last 3 fiscal years. Next slide is revenue by source. The underlines show what the totals were. The 2 key columns are there on the right. The farthest right column is the budget by category, and then the next column is the current fiscal year. You can see the blue is comparing tax revenue, a budget of 337, and we received about 344 at this point. State revenue, as Jen mentioned, those will continue to come in twice a month, but our budget is 173.5 and we're at 138. So total revenue, we've received about 91% of what we've budgeted at this point. And as of April, there will be 2 months left in that process. Next slide. Again, just a visual representation of when those revenue items come in. We talked about those. And the next slide just shows how our total revenue grows through the fiscal year and what it would have looked like without the tax anticipation notes. Next slide, skipping to expenditures, basically the same item here. We're at 82.6% of our spend, which is a little higher than in the prior years. And that's totally based on current year actual expenditures to what was budgeted in total. Next slide. This one gives you general fund expenditures by month. We may actually not include this one in the future. It's kind of up to you guys. We've talked about different scenarios, but the perspective of the monthly, as Jen mentioned, the 3 pay months, you can kind of see the peaks and valleys. The $75 million repay really kind of threw off the comparatives of those, but we wanted to include it for this month. And then the next slide shows total expenditures accumulating throughout the fiscal year. Next slide is our unencumbered, uncommitted expenditure budget. And as we go through the year, the key thing we're looking at here is, you know, how much of the budget is non-encumbered or not committed for salaries or transfers. And so the unencumbered is about 13 million. So meaning it was budgeted, but there's no encumbrance. There are some items that don't require encumbrance, so they may come out of that category. So I wouldn't take away 13 million that's not going to be spent. Because again, part of that is already committed, just not encumbered. And then that does compare to last year, we were at 19 million, where this year we're at 13 million in that category. And then I think Mike's gonna cover the next slide.
Next slide. So this is our statement of cash flow for the month. Net decrease in cash of about 25 million. It's going to be the trend for the next couple of months. With property tax collections. The one thing that's kind of odd there in the revenue, you can see there's a negative in property taxes. That's just from the settlement. So when we get advances, property tax advances, we put it all to the general property tax line. And then the settlement comes, we move things to the right. We settle, we move things to the right. But overall, 24 million in revenue this year, this month, and then 49 million expenses. Went down a little bit from last month because we went from a 3 pay month to a 2 pay month. I think Kevin will take us back and talk about preschool.
Yeah. So the next section is our usual slides about tuition assistance and calculating that.
These are the students that are funded by that $48 million set, the preschool expansion set aside. They get we pay for their tuition, we pay the teacher salaries, but so 1,000 of half of our students are gaining from this effort.
So this breaks down full-time and half-time students, and you'll see the totals 1,048. And just comparatively, it was 996 in the prior year and 892 the year before that. And then the total number of preschool students enrolled, as she mentioned, was 2,078 at the end of April. The next slide is kind of an income statement for the $15 million set aside. So the middle number column there is the FY24 actual. So total revenues that were allocated to that were 15.5 million. There was a payment to United Way, which is how some of that is, or how that is allocated to Preschool Promise. So you can see almost $9 million has been moved to that. 6.4 million is the calculation for those students receiving tuition assistance. And then the other general expenses that come out of there for CPS. Note the expenditures for the year were 22.5 million already. And that's because we're utilizing the cash balance, as we've talked about before. The next slide just shows, again, just a visual of the total number of students that do receive some level of tuition assistance, green being the current year.
Before we move on, Kevin, I think it's worth noting that the total number of students, and I think it's in the one slide there, has not grown at the same rate as the number of preschool students who received tuition. Because I think the actual total number for the prior fiscal year is listed as 2,071 students. We're at 2,078 students. But we are, again, this is just a note that our students who are coming in at preschool level are coming from a very different population in some ways than some of the other communities around us. And so it is worth noting that our students who are coming in do need some of these resources. So it's something for us to think about as to what we want to do long-term with Preschool Promise. Or at least that 15 million set aside for preschool expansion, I should say.
Right.
Because the reality is this is not going to get easier to do in the next few years. It's probably going to get more that we need to do as more students are finding out about it, as more parents are finding out about it, as more opportunities, more spaces open up.
Yeah, and we do have waiting lists.
Yeah, you want great.
Thank you.
I think it's time to go to grants. Next slide, Rob. So April is month 10 to 15 in the 15-month grant cycle. So just kind of thinking through that. Our goal by this time is to spend about 57% of the total. We are doing very well this year. Rob, you get the next slide. Just proud of the grants team and the folks that work with them. We're at 60% overall, which is, well above the last 2 years running. So that's a really nice accomplishment for the folks involved in that. Next slide. Title summary. So this is Title I through Title IV. You can kind of see where we're at. We got 2 columns there. 1% spent of the original budget. And then the second one's with the carryover. Remember, we don't get carryover. We don't really know about it until January. And then by the time we get it, it's closer to March or April. Some really good things like Title II, we've already spent through the entire original allocation, which is awesome. So now we're into using carryover, which is something we want to do. So a lot of good work there. The other thing to remember is a lot of these grants also have significant summer programs. So for example, Title I is going to do some of the summer school stuff. Title III, which is limited English language proficiency. There's some work there. Title IV, just because I know this, they're doing a very large PD, in the next couple of weeks. So a lot to come. Next slide, Rob, is the famous ESSER bar graph. As you can see, those 2 boxes, those 4 boxes are getting closer and closer together, which is what we want. And then the next slide, Rob, is the individual breakdowns. So you can see we are rapidly getting to the end of that grant period and rapidly spending through. I think last slide after that is the ESSER pie chart. I looked at these numbers the other day, they've increased a bit in the last, couple of weeks, so. Or even the pie's shrinking even more, which is what we expected, right? And then I think that's it for grants. If you guys have grants questions.
Questions? Dr.
I
Mike?
do have,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I do have a clarifying question, not necessarily for me, but more for the public. Every school is not a title school.
Every school's in-
So while we are offering summer programs and other things, that is not for every one of our 66. That's for our title schools. I mean, there are qualifications. We've talked about this, and they can watch and just ask Jen if they need to, but I just wanted to clarify that every school is not title. And kudos to you all, because I heard you say that the schools have gotten through their assessment for the year and now they're working on the carryover, right?
Some
And
of-
some of
some
the
of the-
grants,
yeah,
not all of
grants,
them, yeah.
Not all of them, but some of them, yes.
But that's a testament to you and your team. I've complained about this, well, you've heard my mouth about this since last year around title money, carrying it over, and why is it not benefiting our kids? And you all have done a really good job of, I think it's an education and awareness issue, and you've done a great job on making sure that the schools and our teams know what they can spend the money on and the timeline. I think that's helpful. What do you all see as some of the reasons for that benefit?
No, thank you. I appreciate that feedback. I think you're absolutely right. One thing, Rob, if you can go back to the title slide. So just to kind of expand on your point about the carryover, it can be a daunting task. If you look at some of these grants, like I'll take like Title I neglected, for example, right? The total allocation we have to spend is about 537,000. The carrier for this year alone was 291. So more than half of the total we had to spend just carry it from prior years. And so part of the work is kind of getting out of those huge carryovers that we were allowed to take during the COVID waivers.
So we're trying to educate, or re-educate our principals and our budget managers that the money that we have, the general fund money and the grants, is to be spent on the children of that year. They tend to wait to spend their money because they're afraid they're gonna run out. And then at the end of the year, there's like this mad dash to spend, and they're buying things now for next year's students when the grants are supposed to be for those children. And so the carryover sounds like a great thing, and I'm glad we don't lose money if we don't spend it. We get it next year, but you get it in January, you got to spend it by June. So it's a very small window of time to actually manage that. So we're trying, and meeting with the principals and the budget managers on a monthly basis, challenging them to get their money spent. And so that has helped a lot. Just like you said, awareness and education.
I would also say just the on-site review we did with ODEW this year, I think that really got a lot of people thinking, having the state folks come in and get some feedback, and it was useful for a lot of our new principals who had never done that, and new school leadership teams to hear kind of from the state and see this kind of stuff. And then I think my last thing are 2 CRA. Oh, any other grants questions? All right, my last slide are 2 new CRAs for approval on Monday. Now, pretty standard, mixed developments where, first floor is commercial or meeting space, and then upper floors are residential rental units.
So just for the public's edification, the CRA stands for the Community Reinvestment Act agreements, and it's an agreement between the district and the city so they can abate projects to encourage redevelopment, but it allows us to bill the developers directly for our share of the property taxes, and that's what those agreements are. They have to be approved by the board.
And just FYI, our I guess billing for this time just went out a couple weeks ago, so that was about $5.2 million in invoices we sent out
For half a year.
for half a year.
Yeah. Okay. Questions on that? That'll be in the treasurer's report for Monday too.
Awesome.
I
Keep it
lost track
moving.
of the agenda. Cody, okay.
Thank you. Rob, if you could go forward a couple. So the first one we're going to talk about with vendor performance reviews are data coaches. So these first couple slides here just outline all 30 current contracts for data coaches we have in all the schools. The lists are broken out. The first 2 slides are for elementary, second 2 are high school. It also gives the contract cost, the funding source, and just to note, the funding source on all these is either Title I supplemental school improvement, or a combination of both of those grants. So they are all grant funded. And then finally, the KPI measure, and I do want to highlight, a lot of the KPIs were written around reading and math score proficiency increases, or student academic outcome increases. So there's an opportunity here, once the school year concludes, to go back through and score these KPIs, look at the progress that has been made in these academic or those literature categories, and compare schools that have a data coach to schools that don't have a data coach to see how the performance compares. So that'll be an upcoming topic later on once the school year finishes out. Bob, you can go forward a few slides to the first graph. And the last thing to note about all of these are, like I said, there's 30 contracts totaling about 1.8. One more. So these next couple slides will break things down. First few are for elementary, and then we'll switch to high school. So the first thing here just breaks out the contract cost, and the average contract cost right now at the elementary schools is about $42,000. Just to kind of highlight the peaks and valleys here, contracts are written on how many days of service the data coach is there. So if you see a higher cost, that means that school has the data coach for a longer period of time. Like Roselawn, for example, I believe they have it for 157 days. So their contract's a little higher. And based on the current enrollment, we can break out the cost, divide the data coach cost by the current enrollment to give you a per pupil cost. Like I said, Roselawn with the highest contract cost is naturally going to have a higher per pupil. And then take it a step further, since data coaches are really about implementing and using data analysis tools and how to better use the data to teach the students. I want to go ahead and show a representation of per teacher cost. And so these were the teachers that were actually in the buildings as of the end of April. So these costs could shift a little based on whatever FTEs we got going on, but this was the most recent. Next slide, Rob. And then the same kind of breakdown for high schools. So high school averages go up a little higher because they have their data coaches for a lot longer periods of time than the elementary schools. And then the per pupil cost again, so higher per pupil as there are more costs incurred with the data coaches as they have longer. And then finally, a per teacher cost again for the high schools. Slide, Rob. And so I pulled this data from the October 18th Committee of the Whole meeting, just to kind of relate the data coaches and the use of data coaches and academic increases to how they're relating to our district goals. So to focus on goal 1 and the 3rd grade reading proficiency, and then goal 2 with the 6th grade reading gap, and goal 3 with the first time algebra test takers. And you can kind of follow the arrows to see how we are projected to go and how we're projected to end the school year, with our main goal of 2025 being shaded blue. So further review on the data coaches, just as I mentioned earlier, comparing the academic outcomes at schools with data coaches to schools without.
Before we move on to the next, I think, are there any questions on the first KPI?
I just want to say this one thing. And I know you guys have heard this before. I would love to see this on one sheet with regard to cost per pupil grade. And I know we're working on that sort of stuff, but when I saw the graphs and it was by school, just was like, oh. So for me, I'm like, okay, let's kind of get some more data in there too. So I know it's coming. I just wanted to put that on the record.
Thank you, Dr. Mo.
I just want to kind of point out 2 things, and I think it's really the difference between what goes on at the elementary school level versus the high school level. And so what the graphs do show is that there's kind of a continuous pattern of usage also attaches to cost, no matter what kind of cost factor you're looking at. So again, Roselawn and AWL were the 2 highest use. They're also the 2 highest per student. They're also the 2 highest per teacher cost. That is not the same case with the high school level. And I think it's just maybe a curious thing for us to think about, because, for instance, Western Hills had some of the highest use, but then when you look at that cost breakdown per student, it's actually pretty close to the average. Whereas like Euler, jumps up, right? And so I think that's worth us paying a little bit more attention to in some ways of thinking about the effectiveness of some of this use is that, is there a difference in the high school value? How does the high school value change? Are there are they providing a greater value to a larger percentage of students in some of our high schools? As we know that many of our high schools are at some level either at capacity or over capacity, whereas some of our elementary schools don't share that same issue.
So it'd be interesting when all the spring results, data test results come out, if we compare it school by school instead of district wide, to see if that Western Hills had a bigger growth in test results as a result of the data coach. We don't know yet, but that's what what we're trying to drive to.
Yeah, the school's enrollment capacity looks like versus what's the cost per student. Because I do think that is another factor, right? If you're in a space where it's overcrowded with students, you're going to need more assistance to be able to do it, and you may need more to get the same level of results.
Right.
Whereas if you're having a higher cost for, and I know like Roseland has some unique things to itself, AWL has some unique things to them, so we those are factors in there, but for the rest of them, they're pretty even. And then it comes that question of how much of that benefit goes per pupil versus how much of that benefit goes to a space where you're just at a certain capacity. By going up to that next 2 or 3 students,
Mhm.
you're going to need more.
Right.
And that's one of the conversations we've had in the district about growth, is that growth sounds wonderful and it's all great until you got to find a place to put all these people, and got to find someone to teach all these people, and you got to find a building to hold all these people. Especially where we have other parts of our district that are not
Right.
at capacity.
Well, we just have to be careful with this because the data coaches don't work directly with students. They work with the teachers. And so that's another level to consider is whether there's a need for more professional development in that school or.
And again, like the thought process being, if you have a school like Western Hills where you're, at the seams, you need more, it makes sense to have more. If you have a school where you're at 45% capacity and we're saying you need more, well, then maybe that's something else different that is necessary
Right.
to get the better results. But I think it's great for us to be able to see those indicators.
Thank you, Mr. Gregg. Go forward a couple slides. That's the next topic. This one will be brief, is the charter and non-public transportation cost per pupil. So first, I just want to note, worked with Peg Fightmaster and Bert Hughes over at transportation, and they've been great to collaborate with. So I just want to give them a shout out. Peg is rather new to her role with working with the transportation department, but I think she's doing great work and really off to the right foot. So looking here at the bus rates, because I want to highlight the bus rates and the number of buses that we have requested for each of the vendors. So the actuals and the actual costs that we've incurred are still being finalized, and some of the data still needs to be finished. So what we did was we broke out this data based on current bus rate, estimated number of buses for the year, and then used a capacity number based on state guidance of how many kids we could get on the bus. For example, a lot of these were 72 passenger buses, but it's only 72 passengers if they're all K-3 students because of the size of the student. So then you got to consider, if you have different grade levels, what does that capacity look like? So for safe bet here and calculating all this, we kind of did a middle range of assumed you could get 55 students on the bus based on the size of the kids, and did that this way. So next slide, please.
This is just yellow bus service, right?
Correct. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So to note, we based a lot of these on the 173 days of service to calculate these numbers. So bus rate times the number of days, the number of buses we needed them gives the average cost, estimated yearly cost that would be incurred through each of these three vendors. And then the average cost is about $2 million. So, slide. This one breaks it down on the yearly per pupil cost. So like I said, the estimated number based on that state guidance of how many students we can get on the bus and the estimated cost of the bus, we can get a average daily or average yearly per pupil cost of about $1,700, which compares almost right in line with public transportation and using the same facet of the estimation based on the calculations we've been using for this. they were right around the same averages. I think it was maybe a $50 difference, but right around the same average for the
So-
cost.
Can I interrupt you for
Yes,
just a
ma'am.
second? Just so, for a little bit of background, we are required to transport all city residents, whether they attend our schools or not. So if you add up the numbers, we're spending about close to $6 million on charter and non-public students just for yellow bus service. And we don't receive funding for those students because the state funding formula only funds us for our students. We do get a transportation reimbursement, but it's about 50 cents on the dollar, if I can remember correctly. So the,
And the state keeps trying to take it from us.
yes. So, this also presents, and because we don't have any control over their start times and, we have to route those students. That also puts a big drain on our budget. Thank you, Cody. Keep going.
Thank you, Jen. Next slide. So just taking that 173 days that we talked about for days of service and dividing out that yearly per pupil, we get the daily per pupil. So you can see the average is about $10 per day per student for non-public and charter students that we transport. And then finally, bus capacity based on load amount. So load amount is something that transportation uses from their software to get how many students we've transported during the year. So using that and calculating that against the estimated capacity of the buses, we were able to see an average capacity use of 64% of our buses for the non-public and charter students. The next month, we will tackle the topic of scheduling. Any questions on data coaches or transportation?
Any questions? No.
Do you
Again-
see economics at work?
Again, I think this is an added benefit that we've put onto the agenda, and it's something the treasurer recommended us doing that is really telling us how the district is being good stewards of those dollars. So appreciate the hard work.
Sir. Thank you.
All right. As we keep moving along here, I believe we are on to the internal audit team report. So we'll turn it over to our chief auditor.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
So the
Yeah.
finance team was kind enough to print out and put in your folders there. I think I brought some duplicates on accident, but you will find our slides in your packet. And we were asked to come today to provide a bit of an update around internal audit and the work that we do within the district. For those who are not as familiar, we wanted to provide a bit of context about our departments. Oh yes, if you need extra copies, we can pass them around.
Yeah, you should have them in your stack.
Great.
I got them.
Wonderful. So for a bit about internal audit, Rob, if you don't mind jumping to the next slide, you're able to observe here our reporting structure. So you can see that our finance committee members are also a part of our audit committee. So a bit of this information they have already received as they meet with us every other month with our audit committee. However, for the public's sake and for the sake of our finance committee, we wanted to provide a bit of additional context. So in terms of internal audit, we differ from our external audit folks in a couple of ways. Internal audit, our purpose as the Institute of Internal Auditors defines, is an independent and objective assurance and consulting activity designed to add value and improve our organization's operations. So how that differs to our external audit folks are those are typically third-party accounting firms that come in and perform financial or compliance audits. So in our world, that's often Plattenberg, who provides our financial audit on behalf of the auditor of state each year. So moving on, we wanted to do a bit of a look back before we look forward. So our year in review for fiscal 2024, we completed our internal audit plan as we do each year, but the table shown on the slide provides a summary of each of the categories of projects we completed, as well as the specific names of those projects. So we've had the unique pleasure of reviewing each of those throughout the year with our audit committee. I will, however, highlight a couple of key projects that were really unique to our work this year. The first being our school audits. This was the first time we've gone out to our schools to observe how centrally designed financial processes operate in a school environment. It was a fantastic learning experience for our team as well as for our audit committee, and I think formed a wonderful relationship for us with a few of those schools. So we hope to take that work and build upon it as we look into the upcoming year. Further, we did a tremendous amount of work, and by we, I mean Isaac, on the status of past internal audit recommendations. In partnership with management, we started receiving bi-monthly updates for all of the past recommendations we've issued. And with the support of the board, we've seen a lot of progress in the implementation. I even brought a note, our numbers increased from 76 in October 2023 of outstanding recommendations to 57 in April. So our upcoming update, I should say, is coming in June. So we're really excited to see how much progress continues, and big kudos to the Treasurer's Office team who owns a good deal of our recommendations year over year. So looking ahead, we wanted to use a bit of time. I'll keep it rather brief, but happy to go into detail to whatever degree the committee would prefer. But we wanted to use a little bit of time to look into fiscal 2025 and what lies ahead. The slide above here shows our annual audit cycle. And what we wanted to highlight in today's conversation is our plan for the next few months. So we're currently working to develop our fiscal 2025 internal audit plan, which will incorporate a lot of the multi-year projects we started the groundwork and laid the groundwork for this year, as well as our continuous auditing work that we've shared through audit committee correlates as past recommendations are implemented. We can then come in and test and see how they're functioning. So that's our continuous auditing work. And then finally, we typically select audits, projects and content area based on the results of our annual risk assessment. So that's where we weight things based on the risk or materiality to decide what projects would be of highest priority. So our goal as we look to our next audit committee in June would be to provide an internal audit plan framework with the things that we know are fairly certain. And then our idea that we wanted to share with the finance committee today is utilizing the July and August timeframe to continue inserting information into our risk assessment to better hone in on what exact projects we should be focused on for the year. And what that information is that we would be looking for are the final numbers from our budget, as well as our strategic decision as that its direction, as that develops over the coming months. So that would be our hope, is to put the framework together for June, finalize with additional details come August, and then meanwhile continue working through those core projects and then get to full work in September as well. So the final slides here is just to bring it all together. So one of the things I think we've been working really hard on between finance and audit committee is alignment. How do we all work together with our committees as well as internal audit and management? So these are just really quick depictions, I should say, of the roles in our governance framework. So this stresses the importance of each of the roles that we play between our board, our management team, and internal audit. As well as the following slide shows the 3 lines of defense, which prove the importance of all of the internal controls and work that each of us do to provide a solid control and operational framework. So the key here, and what will lead to a bit of discussion, I hope, is the next slide around our organizational alignment. So I think we could use a couple of minutes today just to think through how do we continue the work from fiscal 24 into fiscal 25 around our alignment of our goals and work plans, as well as our alignment between internal audit and management. We've already made a lot of great progress towards aligning our connection between quality improvement and internal audit recommendations. And Cody has been kind enough to offer his assistance in helping us measure our impact and ROI too, and help us start to speak that same language. So those are some of the goals and hopes as we look into this upcoming year, but wanted to open up the floor for any feedback and discussion as we think through what fiscal 25 might look like from an audit perspective and in partnership with finance.
Yeah. So, and I'll turn it over to the thoughts from our board members here, but I wanted to make sure to highlight one big thing, which is that you know, at the last audit committee meeting and our last few audit committee meetings, they've really been impressed and enjoyed looking at the information around some of our KPI work that we've been doing. And I think part of that is because it speaks to the language they are so familiar with in monitoring whether or not the district's operating well, whether or not the district's being smart about it. And so I didn't want to let that go unsaid and expressed. But I do want to turn it over to any board members who have thoughts or ideas. Dr. Moffitt?
Well, please excuse me because I'm gonna have to leave for another engagement. But I'm impressed. I stay impressed with the work that you all are doing. I think that to have you realign with and explain publicly what your role is super, super helpful. I'm happy to see we've had some reductions in the number of flags, and that's a great trend that I'm hoping that we can keep going. And I look forward to your updates during the audit committee. I also want to share, it was really great having you join Just Ask Jen last month to share a little bit about what you do. And I think that helps. It should help the community to recognize that we're trying to not only be responsible fiscal agents and responsible adults, but we are also working to make sure that our processes are working too. So thanks for that. Thanks to the team.
Okay, I'll offer a couple thoughts because I'm still on my goal to beat Mike Morosky one day in the length of board meetings, committee meetings. But the two thoughts that I do have that I think going into 2025, I think one is something I've already been proposing, and I think it's something we should already be doing or already should have done, but something we should do for this year, which is to do some similar presentation like this before the full board. I think one of the reasons is that we sometimes ask internal audit to do stuff that is not internal audit work. Right. And I think it's because there's no one else that we can think of who can do that work. But the reality is you all have a lot already on your plate. And I think this is one of the things that we do too often in the school district is that we task folks who already have a lot on their plate to do more as if there's nothing else they are already doing. Right. And so that's one. I think the second thing is that there are a number of things that you mentioned there were 70, 73 previously, or 76 previously, and I think we're down to 53. But there are a number of those things that are stuff that we routinely and we'll probably do some type of level of rotation with. I think developing the ones that are rotational, where every 3 to 5 to 7 years we go back in and look, versus ones that we're going back and looking because they have not completed or have not performed. Right? Because I think those are different in some ways, although they may overlap. So you may have like the one that you normally do 7 years, we do it every 2 because they haven't done it. But I think a large part of what our rotations have been is really about the fact they had problems that we were trying to identify and find out, and we're going back to see if they done it. That next level to internal audit is really what's the cycle of each of these different things that we're monitoring. So I mean, I just think again, and that may come with the risk assessment work you are doing right now. That may come with, we've talked about in audit committee, figuring out those kind of bandwidths. The third thing I will mention, and again, stop there, is the school audits. And I know this is something we've really been thinking about and developing, but we talked about it in audit committee about the fact that those are the things that we're looking at processes. And as we go through and we think about those processes, some of those processes may need some revamping and some retooling, but that's not something we figure out by right now, right? And so the work that you all are doing right now is to actually just be able to assess what do we have? What are those processes, right? So where are we seeing people utilizing those processes? I think that's the best place for us to be right now with the school audits, because I think when we get to this point of trying to recommend things, we talked about the state being every 2 years. Well, we're every year budgeting. So like to implement some of these things, and then the next year we be told, well, we don't have any, we're not doing that anymore. It's not helpful until we know what everybody's doing and how everybody's using the different processes. And so I think as much as we can, focusing some of the stuff that we're upcoming and new stuff around getting the information, so we're better able to assess it, better it is. Because what we may learn is some folks are doing things that are just actually not the right way that they were supposed to be doing it in the first place. And that may be one first step, is maybe correcting the misunderstandings, misinformation. Those are my 3 things that I thought to pass over to you all for feedback. And I again appreciate you all doing this presentation for us, because I don't know, at least my prior 2 years in the Budget Finance and Growth Committee, we have not had an explanation of the work you all are doing being put forth like that. Neat. Yes. All right. Next topic is the treasurer's goals.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off with an apology because at the last meeting, we got some feedback and I took that feedback. The one was about the fourth goal being the first goal, moving it up, and I did do it, but when I went back to updated measures, I did it on the wrong document. So the order of the goals is not correct on the paper that you have in front of you. And I will fix that and send it back out, correct it and send it back out. So I don't know if you want me to go through them again or.
I don't know you need to necessarily go through them, but I know again the goal for at least I know we've talked about it, but goal 4 was moved up to
Was the ROI one?
yep.
We wanted that to be first, and so the document you have is an older version, but it has we were trying to add measures to it, and I just started updating the wrong version of the document. So I'll merge them together and send them back out. But for the most part, the goals are surround increasing financial engagement, or adding more to the ROI KPI efforts. Data integration amongst the systems, more information on financial dashboards, and preparing for my exit.
Any thoughts, Ben?
I do not have any thoughts at the moment. Thank you.
Again, I think the goals that you have put down here, I think are for me, they're great. I think one of the things I would want us to, and maybe this is part of that developing a long-term financial
Yes.
strategy idea, is that, again, I'm pushing it because I think it's important and I think it's shows us being better at what we're doing, but to start some way of figuring out how to start our process earlier when we talk about the budget.
Right.
Because I do think this is why we are so far behind, is because and there's a number of factors that go into why we started so late, but I think that's one of the, if you're leaving us with a legacy rather than just staying with
Yes.
us forever, this would be one of the great legacies of improving the efficiency of how we do our budget.
Right. And so just to add a little bit of background to that. So what we went through today was the 5-year forecast on the general fund. What I want to do is do that on steroids and start adding the capital improvement plans, facilities, technology, cycle refreshes, and curriculum, updates, new adoptions. And so every year in the budget, I want it to be our budget, but here's our longer term plan, because it's not easy to plan to how to finance things when they come up quickly. So want to develop some kind of a tool that will help the district walk through that in the future.
And then the only thing I would maybe add in, and I don't know how we add this into the pipeline kind of plan there, is just, I know we've already been working with the schools and the principals to understand their budgets, manage those type of things. But I'm just wondering if there's a way to add an element of like bringing some of those expertise, or allowing some folks at that level, at the school level, who want that expertise and want that knowledge to be able to kind of grow in that, whether it's some type of Just Ask Jen that's really focused on school budget, or whether it's something else that might be a part of that.
So I'm in public affairs right now is my next animated whiteboard on how to build a school budget. And so some in the next 2 or 3 weeks, it'll get published. So,
Okay.
yeah. And then those are always posted on our website, so you can watch them over and over and over again.
Great. Because I mean, again, I think that the succession planning within the treasurer's office is very important, but I think beyond the treasurer's office
Good point.
helps the treasurer's office do their work as well.
Since I've been the treasurer over the last 9 years, we've had conversations about who should the school treasurers work for or report to? Because I think what Lauren and her team found is that every school operates differently. There's not like a standard way to do these actions. And it's hard to keep, when there's turnover, it's hard to keep all those people trained properly and timely. And so, as we're closing out a year, we're getting a lot of requests for exemptions on, can I enter this because my clerk was out on maternity leave and this sub didn't know what to do. So, we want to work some way into, whoever they report to, they need to have a dotted line to us so that we can bring them in and hold them, train them and hold them accountable to those behaviors. So thank you for bringing that up.
Well, I think we've given you kind of our feedback and then that comes back to the board for us as a board to then adopt your goal, which we will do this year. Is adopt your goals unlike
Yes.
past years. And maybe the next audit team report is how much of the stuff the board said they were going to do in doing their governance work did they actually do. Just wanted to the last portion of what we have today are really just things to hit on, bring up to the discussion, not necessarily to do anything action wise on or to. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, totally forgot about that part. So Rob, if you want to go ahead and give the hearing the public portion, as President Bolt would say, if you want to do the do before we hit the other business and then open it up.
Yeah, if you'd like to speak during the speaking of the public, which will be right after this next section, please click the hand icon to raise your hand. We will ask you your name and school association, and we will invite you in during that session. Thank you very much.
All righty. Good old Mr. Wilson keeping us on packed. All right. So the first thing on the other business was just a discussion point to bring it up to as something for us to think about. Treasurer Wagner, if you want to.
Excuse me, I mentioned this earlier during the forecast conversation, but I'd like to recommend a written policy that for the board to adopt regarding a balance on cash. And so that we're not spending down too far. And so we'll hope to bring a draft to you at the June Finance Committee meeting. So it'll go to finance, then to policy, and then to the board.
So board member Lindy will get to see it twice a month here. Any thoughts? Okay. I think it's a good thing for us to be talking about and thinking about again as a practice. We keep a cash balance for a reason. And as we get low on that cash balance, it makes it more difficult for us to function and operate. And so having a policy that dictates kind of what our goals are and what we're supposed to be doing with regard to that is a good thing for us to do.
Yes, maintaining a healthy cash balance means the board continues to make those decisions instead of having the state come down and do that for you. So we will do that. I forgot to mention earlier, there's going to be a resolution to be adopted Monday night accepting the tax rates. This is something we do every year at the Hamilton County Auditor recalculates the millage tax rates, and then you have to adopt them in a resolution. So that's being prepared. I think it was sent to the board yesterday. Okay, just wanted to mention that because typically we share the resolutions with the Finance Committee first.
Yep. And then the next two are just a couple of topics that were brought up at the last meeting that I think is just something for us to think about as one of our next meetings. I believe Mr. Lindy brought up just the population change effects and how they affect our enrollment in the future and kind of discussions around that. I think that's really important. Something that was already on my mind, but I think it's actually something really important that we should be discussing in the context of thinking about how our schools are operated, right? But also to what we were, to the KPI discussion there earlier, we have portions of our city that just have more kids that are coming to our schools. And the reality is that that's not going to change in the next couple of years. And we're not going to build a building in the next year or two. So we do need to be thinking about what are the boundary lines? What are the what are the resources that are needed at those schools? What are the costs that come with having a school on one side that has 101% enrollment and a school in another portion that has 29, 30% enrollment? And that's just a hard discussion for a board to have, but we need to start that conversation at least.
So we can invite Jeremy Gollihue, who does work with the enrollment guru, Matt Cropper, demographer. Thank you. And we can have them come to Finance Committee, do a presentation on enrollment historical trends and that kind of stuff. And when would you like to see that?
I think let's shoot sometime August, because I think what we want to do that is in the context of after we've gotten through, hopefully by then we've at least completed a budget or come close. But But I do think that's something for us to be thinking about as we think about next year's budget and how how the district will be operated. I think the other part to that is that it also is a good conversation around preschool as well, because we know we have preschool districts that are not because we don't have preschools in the area, but because we have more kids that will need preschool services than spaces at the preschools.
Correct.
So it's again another part of that conversation point. And again, that's another way that we don't get paid for preschool from the state. So if we're expanding preschool opportunities or resources, we're gonna have to figure out how that gets put into the budget somewhere. Or if we do get paid from it, it's like 50% of what we should actually need. So these are all, again, important things I think about as we think about growth and think about where growth is happening and where it's not happening. And in our conversations, I know Dr. Moffitt's not here, but she is leading the conversations with the city. And again, decisions made at the city level affect us dramatically. Development in spaces where you then lose the population means we lose students in those schools. Overcrowding of other areas mean we get more students in those schools. The last one is one that Dr. Moffitt had brought up, which is the residential abatements. And again, it's something I think we can continue to think about and talk about. I think they're a bigger conversation for the one that Kevin was having earlier, which is regard to property values going up as a result, means we get a lower percentage as part of the formula mix. So it is something for us to be thinking about. And again, it might be something we talk about August, September.
Okay.
To add to our agenda if we don't have enough on there. And then as always, we will have our June, we'll see. We'll have our either 90-day appropriation will go through its normal process, or if we manage to secure a full budget, it will come to us before it goes to the full board. But I think we'll just kind of keep the rest of our regular June agenda going forward.
Okay.
Rob, are there any folks? No?
We have an in-person public person.
Well, and Ms. Dunn, since you were after we did all our introductions, you introduce yourself first and go ahead. Jane.
About looking ahead to other topics, and that is the commercial tax abatement ordinance will be expiring in 2025. That's between the board, yourselves, and the city of Cincinnati. One of those matters in that ordinance is setting the pilot payment percentage that comes from commercial properties. So I just thought I would bookmark that for discussion, for your discussion, as well as it's another big topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know we've had a conversation about how the pilot payments process has worked. I think this is one that we and as well as policy committee can also tackle.
Mm-hmm. So the general counsel, Dan Hoying, and I have already started meeting with the city at their request because there's a change in the recent law regarding TIF payments. And so we've had 2 meetings, and right now we're just educating each other on how impact is happening. And so that's why we started building a slide deck on how property taxes impacts the state funding formula, because it's very clear they didn't understand that the last time we negotiated, and it became a bone of contention between us. But the conversations are very great, and I think we're meeting again the 1st or 2nd week in June. I forget when, but so thank you, Michelle, for bringing that up. But yeah, we are having those conversations.
And again, we have a city council that has, for the most part, turned over completely since, past conversations. And so they will have they may have a different point of view. They may have the same point of view. That's good for us to figure out and talk with them.
Right.
All righty. Anything else for the good of the agenda here? The good of the, well, if there's nothing else, and